20 years ago, Putin called the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. However, for many peoples who lived in the Soviet Empire, this catastrophe actually became a true salvation. A chance to live a normal life, to independently solve their internal and external problems, to choose their own path of development. And most importantly, not to listen to Big Papa from the Kremlin. However, many may have a perfectly logical question. Could the Union of Indestructible Free Republics have survived back then, in distant 1991? Did it have any chance of being saved? After all, just a few months before the GKCHP, the big Russian bear was roaring and writhing, but it wasn't planning to die at all. How did it happen that a coup, which lasted only 3 days, triggered a process that was completely irreversible? Today we will analyze the domestic political situation that developed on the eve of the August coup. Of course, we will also look at the coup itself, but most importantly, we will assess its geopolitical consequences. And in general, let's think about whether the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had any chances of survival. This video is a logical continuation of the previous one about how Gorbachev tried to preserve the year unexpectedly, and S. On Laika is like a clown with S. It should. What happened in the spring of 91? In the spring of 1991, many people felt, and not without reason, that the once united and powerful Union was gradually and steadily sliding into the abyss. This was most evident in the deep economic crisis caused by Gorbachev's half-hearted reforms, which did not always match the real situation. Galloping inflation, combined with a shortage of basic necessities, led to a sharp deterioration in an already poor standard of living. The invisible hand of the market, which many experts had hoped for, could not bring success because there were no legal mechanisms to protect private entrepreneurship. The first Soviet businessmen often fell victim both to hardened criminals and to extortion by law enforcement agencies and officials who wanted to get their cut. In fact, such enterprising and proactive people had to act at their own risk. In the political sphere, the processes were also contradictory. Democratization and the abolition of the Communist Party's monopoly led to the emergence of other political parties in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics on a legal basis. They had alternative points of view on what was happening and offered their own ways out of the current situation. For the first time since the 1917 revolution, people had a real opportunity to choose, which just a couple of years earlier had been completely unthinkable. But on the other hand, the key positions in the government were still held by the same party bigwigs, which was completely unacceptable for many people. After all, as it was previously believed, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was needed to lead society on the path to building communism. And if communism was unattainable, which by 1991 everyone from young to old was already saying, then what was the point of this party? None of the bright futures builders wanted to leave their comfortable offices, so many ideological communists reinvented themselves as liberals and Democrats, just in case. But the main problem, and this was already obvious to the naked eye, was that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was falling apart, literally bursting at the seams. It was no longer possible to hide these problems. By early 1991, 6 of the 15 Soviet republics, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Armenia, Georgia, and Moldova, had chosen to secede from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They chose to leave the friendly Soviet family to live their own lives independently. Authorities tried to stop these processes by force, but the violent events in Vilnius and Riga showed clear local anti-Soviet sentiment. To suppress all this by force, the country would have been flooded with blood. Gorbachev still didn't dare do it. However, fate gave him a chance in the form of an all-union referendum on the preservation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which was held on March 17, 1991. More than 76% of those who voted supported the preservation of the Soviet Union. In the previous video, I discussed in detail the reasons behind such a phenomenal result. But, be that as it may, the authorities received an official reason to keep the Union from final collapse. If 9 out of 15 republics could relaunch this failed project called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, in history, this last attempt to revive the Soviet system became known as the Novo-Ogaryovo process, the Union of Soviet Sovereign Republics. Yes, you heard that right. That's exactly what the Soviet Empire was supposed to be called after the planned upgrade. So basically, the shell would still be the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, but the content would be different. Only instead of socialist, they would be sovereign. It was published on August 15, and its official signing was scheduled for August 20, and thus the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was supposed to get a new lease on life. But in reality, things turned out differently. The Union Treaty did indeed significantly expand the powers of the Union republics, primarily in the social, economic, and cultural spheres. Additionally, local political elites gained powers that had belonged to Moscow. Thus, this renewed, decentralized Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was ideally supposed to turn from a declarative federation into a genuine one, where all its subjects would have equal rights and opportunities. They also removed all references to the Communist Party and building communism from the text. No one had believed in this nonsense for a long time, and now it was time to let it go. And there were some nuances at the official level as well. Only representatives from 9 Union republics, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, participated in the Novo-Ogaryovo process. That is, the Baltic countries, as well as Armenia, Georgia, and Moldova, permanently left the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Thus, it can already be stated that preserving Gorbachev and many of those around him were well aware of this. The empire strikes back. But some people didn't realize this, or refused to accept life's realities with their conservative mindset. Some members of the ruling elite, who verbally supported Gorbachev and his policies, were in fact sabotaging his decisions in every possible way and trying to keep everything as it was. Such opposition elements within the ruling elite had existed since the very first days of perestroika, but for a while they disguised themselves as loyal and devoted party members. And only the threat of collapse forced them to come out and play openly. The attempt went down in history as the August coup. The conspirators themselves were that part of the top party elite who absolutely refused to adapt to the realities of life. For them, the golden era was the stable period of Brezhnev, and some of them were outright Stalinists. Therefore, Budushchi Pochisti strongly opposed the Soviet economy's shift to market principles, the abandonment of communist ideology, and the democratization of social and political life. The revolutions of Eastern Europe, which in fact removed them from under the control of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But most importantly, they were terrified of the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, because in that case, they would have finally lost their power. It's no coincidence that the rebels decided to strike right on the eve of the signing of the new Union Treaty on August 19. To carry out their plan, they bypassed the constitution and other laws and created a special body called the State Committee on the State of Emergency of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, abbreviated as GKCHP. It included 8 representatives of the Soviet elite, headed by the second person in the state, Vice President Gennady Yanayev. But the actual organizer of the coup was the head of the KGB, Vladimir Kiryuchkov, and this is not surprising at all, since the KGB officers were the most interested in preserving the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the Soviet system as a whole. It has always been this way. Just remember, which agency did the current great gatherer of Russian lands come from? And in all state coups, the security forces have always played the leading role. That's why it wasn't surprising to see the roles of state committee members, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov, and Interior Minister Boris Pugo. 3 days that changed the world. There once lived an American writer and staunch communist named John Reed. He wrote the book 10 days that shook the world, dedicated to the Bolsheviks' rise to power in 1917. So, it took only 3 days to bring down the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, 3 days that shook the world and changed it forever, from August 19th to 21st, 1991. Imagine the scene, an early sunny morning on August 19 Monday. People had just woken up and were getting ready to go to work, and then bam, all Union radio announces breaking news of extreme importance. The President of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Gorbachev, is seriously ill and cannot fulfill his duties, so his powers are transferred to the Vice President of the country, Gennady Yanayev. It was also announced that the highest body of state power, the State Committee on the State of Emergency, had been established. Gorbachev was vacationing at the government dacha in Foros on Crimea's southern coast. The night before, conspirators ordered the security detail to cut all outside communication. For 3 days, the former leader of a powerful country lived as a captive, though in comfortable home conditions. Meanwhile, across the country, the State Committee for the State of Emergency issued a decree imposing a state of emergency for 6 months. This automatically meant a ban on any rallies, demonstrations and strikes, as well as the suspension of political parties, public organizations and mass movements. This effectively rolled back democratization and restored one-party dictatorship. And to make sure no one would dare, troops with armored vehicles were brought into Moscow, which the coup generals had gathered near the capital in advance. In short, all those fragile positive achievements that had taken place in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics during the years of perestroika were simply unknown. The GKCHP members did not take into account one extremely important factor, the mood of the broad masses of the people. In 1991, people were no longer that intimidated, downtrodden herd whose minds were regularly brainwashed by propaganda. Glasnost and democratization were not in vain. People stopped seeing themselves as just a population and became citizens the authorities had to consider. Those raised in the spirit of Soviet servility were never able to grasp this simple, genuine truth. We shouldn't overlook the individual's role in history, like Russia's first president, Boris Yeltsin. No matter how much he was later cursed with every swear word or mocked for his fondness for strong drinks, in those decisive August days he showed true miracles of courage and bravery. He quickly became the main resistance to the coup, acting decisively and promptly. He called the GKCHP's actions a coup d'etat and urged citizens to defend the constitutional order. In Moscow, St. Petersburg and other cities, tens of thousands of people took to the streets in demonstrations to defend democracy and the constitutional order. Not just in Russia, but in other republics too. For example, on August 20, a mass protest was held in central Kiev, organized by the People's Movement of Ukraine and other democratic groups. There were also serious protests in Tallinn, Riga, Tbilisi and Minsk. People took to the streets because they understood one simple truth. If the State Committee on the State of Emergency stays in power, all their plans for independence or even for expanding autonomy will simply be wiped out. It is quite possible that the new authorities would have sent troops to suppress any protest activity. Very few people wanted a return to the Brezhnev era, and even fewer to the Stalin era. And returning to the topic of the role of individuals in history, it should be noted that the conspirators themselves were indecisive and failed to adequately assess the reality of the situation. At the time, journalists aptly noted that during their first and only press conference, the members of the GKCHP looked rather dull and sluggish, and many of them simply had trembling hands. There was clear evidence of poor organization of the coup itself, lack of coordination, as well as a poor understanding of the situation on the ground. Many military personnel simply refused to follow the orders of the command regarding dispersing rallies and clearing buildings seized by protesters, and the number of protesters was growing by the hour, especially in Moscow. The climax came on the night of August 20th to 21st, when, as a result of a clash on the Garden Ring between protesters and armored vehicles of the Taman Division, 3 people were killed. The death of innocent people outraged an already agitated public. Frightened by the scale of the protest and unwilling to take responsibility for further casualties, the State Committee on the State of Emergency backed down and, to avoid bloodshed, ordered the withdrawal of soldiers and military equipment from Moscow. With these actions, the coup plotters essentially admitted their defeat. They finally realized that the overwhelming majority of the people were absolutely opposed to returning to the past. Therefore, they could only stay in power solely and exclusively by force. That would inevitably mean a lot of bloodshed. But the members of the GKCHP did not possess the decisiveness or bloodthirstiness of Stalin and other such dictators. So, they decided to back off while they still had the chance. With Gorbachev's return to Moscow on the night of August 22, the August coup was finally suppressed. Later, all the rebels were arrested, except for the Minister of Internal Affairs, Pugo, who shot himself in the head. The last attempt. GKCHP's failure prevented the Union Treaty from being signed. Moreover, the coup led to the completely opposite effect. The republics that had previously expressed a desire to remain in the renewed Union began to leave the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And the first example was set by Ukraine, declaring its independence on August 24, 1991. Then a chain reaction followed. Within a month, similar decisions were made in Azerbaijan, Belarus, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and all the remaining republics. No one wanted to stay on the sinking ship anymore. However, the fact that almost everyone who could left the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics doesn't mean that they didn't try to revive the empire. They certainly did. From September to December 1991, Moscow repeatedly tried to preserve the remnants of this sinking ship. But now, instead of Gorbachev, who had completely lost all his power and authority, Yeltsin took over. He tried everything to keep Ukraine and Belarus, and if possible Kazakhstan and other Central Asian republics. But first and foremost, the Russian president sought to maintain control specifically over Ukraine, in any format, whether as part of a renewed union or in the form of some other integration association. As long as Moscow controlled Kiev, Yeltsin openly said that with Ukraine, Russia would be a European power, but without it, it would be an Asian one. It's no coincidence. Later, this idea was confirmed by American strategist Zbigniew Brzezinski, who said that without Ukraine, Russia would cease to exist. With Ukraine bribed and then subordinated, Russia automatically turns into an empire. Now do you understand why Putin first started a hybrid and then a full-scale invasion? In 1991, the Kremlin lost control over Ukraine, Belarus, and others. Specifically so that Yeltsin would have no doubts about the mood of the Ukrainian people, a nationwide referendum was held on December 1. At it, almost 91% of Ukrainians expressed their desire to live an independent life, free from anyone's control. Voila, as they say. By the way, Ukraine was the only one of all 15 post-Soviet countries that held such a referendum. In all the others, a parliamentary decision was enough. But after such results, Moscow had nothing to counter with. That's why Yeltsin agreed to recognize Ukraine's independence by signing the Belavazia Accords. And the legal dissolution of the Soviet Empire was formalized on December 26, 1991 by a decision of the Supreme Soviet of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That's where it belongs. So, was there a chance? Of course, I prefer concrete facts here, but still, let's consider, so to speak, an alternative history. To do this, we should consider several options. If the August coup had not happened and the new Union Treaty had still been signed, then most likely the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics would have survived in a more liberal, decentralized form. However, it would no longer be the same union as before, but a reduced version of it with 9 republics. In the future, conflicts between the republics and the Union Center, along with local elites' ambitions, would likely have caused a gradual collapse. If not in a year, then in 5 or 10 years. It would have been much worse for everyone if the GKCHP had remained in power. If the coup plotters had suppressed the protests by force, the new dictatorship would inevitably have provoked resistance in the republics and most likely would have led to civil war. And the pressing economic problems would have remained unresolved, which would have made preserving the union impossible in the long run. But in reality, the August coup finally buried Gorbachev's plans and later Yeltsin's to preserve the empire in any form. The State Committee for the State of Emergency didn't breathe new life into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics with its own hands, but rather finally strangled it. Both the Republican elites and ordinary people were afraid of a repeat of such actions by conservative forces of the Stalin-Brezhnev era, and therefore tried to distance themselves from Moscow as quickly as possible. It was already completely impossible to get rid of Union control, to feel truly independent, and to stop these processes. That's all from me. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye, everyone.